Dune Awakening has one of the most brutal mechanics of any survival game. You have the ability to lose 20, 40, possibly even 60 hours of gameplay in a flash, a blink of an eye. And this is where we meet the ultimate foe. On the refined, blistering sandpit of Arrakis, you'll find your greatest enemy, Shai Hulud. Imagine you're a solo player getting to the final tier, having the ultimate buggy made of all the late game material, clothing, weapons, or all rare schematics, and all of this is taking you hours upon hours. And in a moment of weakness, overconfidence, or just being pure greedy, it can all be swallowed and gobbled in an instant. So how does the Shai Hulud mechanics actually work, and can you outrun the legendary worm within Dune Awakening? Tip number 1, we're going to Haggar Basin South where you start. So here is Haggar Basin South, and these blue circles are sort of rough estimates of where you'll spawn. Now, it should be very difficult to get eaten in Haggar Basin because you have so many rock formations. So tip number 1 is just make sure when you're traversing anywhere within Arrakis, you're making sure that you're traveling safely as possible until you understand and get a good feeling of how the worm system works. So you want to be crossing in obvious places where you'd stick to the side of rock formations and cross at the most obvious points. Wherever you can shorten the distance, you would then traverse that way just to ensure that you are reducing the risk. So tip number 1 is an obvious one. Just make smart traversal moves. Hang close to the rock formations and cross on the most logical paths. Over time, it gets a bit easier to understand and you can make more calculated, risky exploration without worrying too much. And here's tip number 2, and this is very important as this will help quantify some of the mechanics of how Shai Hulud work. From my testing, at least within the beta, you are roughly looking at 30 seconds. Once the worm activity indicator starts vibrating, you have 30 seconds roughly before a worm is called. And that's only if the worm is nowhere in sight or hasn't been triggered. In the example on screen now, the worm is already active within my area, so it only takes about 15 seconds to trigger the worm popping out of the sand. So if it's nowhere to be seen, you're looking at roughly 30 seconds. If it's in the vicinity, it's about 15. However, how does this work with drum sand? Basically, you're going to cut this time in half. So as an example, let's say it takes 30 seconds exactly to trigger a worm call. Well, drum sand is pretty much going to cut that in half. So if you were traveling across drum sand the entire time, in about 15 seconds, a worm would be called. Now, what is going to change some of the timing and the feeling of how quick a worm is called will be determined on your vehicle's speed. If you're traveling much slower, it will feel like the worms get called much quicker. But if you're flying through, it will feel like you have plenty of time. So understanding roughly how the mechanic is going to sort of trigger, what are some other things we can do? Well, tip number 3 is ensure you're upgrading the relative parts that will increase your vehicle's speed, and in some cases, even lower the vibration the vehicle emits, increasing the time it takes for the worm call, which may extend that 30 seconds to 40, but maybe not much more than that. It's really going to be speed that will be the most noticeable and beneficial aspect to avoiding getting eaten. You'll make one sandbike engine is going to be slower than your sandbike 2 engine. And that's the case for all the vehicles. Each tier should increase speed, and it should tell you in the description, because the faster you get, the easier it's going to be to avoid getting eaten. There are a few caveats to this, as we've learned from the beta that there's certain gear, compactors, uniques, that may increase or decrease the time it takes to attract a worm. So keep that in mind. It's not a blanket 30 to 40 seconds to call a worm. It will be determined on your gear, what activity you're doing, where you are, how many worms are present in the map, etc. Tip number 5. When you're making your first journey from Haggar Basin South to Vermilius Gap, you can make the same mistake I made, as you get a mission from the trade post, which puts a marker over sort of here, and I made the mistake of trying to cross Haggar Basin South into Vermilius Gap in an unusual location. So tip number 5 is ensure that you're traveling and migrating, moving across this area right here. And I'll show you with an example. This is by far the best and really the way you're meant to cross into Haggar Basin South the first time. Down the track with increased speed on the vehicles, you can be adventurous and cross from other areas, but it does add a lot more risk. So always cross from the Haggar Basin South into the Vermilius Gap through this flat area here. Otherwise, you have a very good chance of getting eaten, as it's definitely going to take more than 30 seconds to cross across all the difficult terrain. anywhere else. This will save you a lot of pain and mistakes, as I did not discover this area and I tried to cross around here and lost all my stuff, and I did that twice. So I really had to learn the hard way. It seems so silly and obvious now, but just make sure you are crossing here. It will make your life so much easier and you won't lose all that progress multiple times. Tip number 6. This will kind of be an obvious one, but one I often forget. And when you're making any kind of stop on the sand, whether it be for a crashed ship which tempts you with its glorious loot, if you're going to spend any amount of time on these locations, always try to face your vehicle in the direction to the closest safety rock formation, because one thing that will let you down time and time again is having to make any kind of maneuvers while trying to escape, particularly if you don't have any boost or any way to recover that lost time from turning the vehicle around and facing it in the direction. Just like in my example in the beginning, I headed in 1, the wrong direction, 2, my vehicle really should have been facing the other way, and I should never have been that greedy. I knew the worm was coming. I'd been out on the sand too long. But sometimes you try risk it for the biscuit, and in these times it really can help to ensure your vehicle is facing in the direction of the closest safety. The only time this won't be super effective is if the worm spawns in front of you, which leads us to the next tip. Building on the mechanics of how much time you can be on sand before you call a worm, what actually happens after you call a worm. So from my testing, you can technically be on the sand riding right next to a worm and it's not going to attack you, but definitely make sure it doesn't go under you or you don't go over it, as you'll sustain a ton of damage to your vehicle and you'll probably get thrown around, possibly die. However, you can in fact pretty much travel alongside a worm up until the animation of the sandworm popping out of the sand. And depending on the animation of the worm, sometimes it's a shorter animation, sometimes it's a longer animation. If it's the longer one, you'll have more time to escape. If it's the short one, at most 10 to 15 seconds to escape, depending when the worm spawns. But it's really handy to know that you don't have to be fearful of the worm at all until it's popped up and done that animation. Now, the only time this doesn't apply is if you're in a group and you're all within the same area and someone else has triggered the worm. If you're in that same immediate area, the worm will also go for you as well. It won't have to go through the animation twice. But if you're solo, you only need to worry about once that animation's triggered. But if you are traveling and the worm has been spawned very recently due to someone else, avoid the worm, as it won't have to play through the animation. But again, just to highlight, you're pretty much safe from the worm until that animation is triggered. If you trigger that animation, you can step onto some rock formations, and within about 15 seconds, you can probably go back onto the sand, and then that will re-trigger the same animation again. And this is definitely handy to know if you're considering spending any kind of time idling on the sand, whether it's for resources or whatever. Now, this next tip is huge, and this is going to be very interesting to see how the guilds manipulate this mechanic. And this secret was revealed during a Q&A. It's kind of slipped out of one of the devs' mouths, but one of the questions was how many worms exist within Haggar Basin, and one of the devs alludes to there being about 8 worms that can be spawned at the same time within Haggar Basin South. This is really handy to know, because what that will mean is that guilds potentially may be able to manipulate this by deliberately calling the worm to 8 players and then allowing them to mine. We don't have any idea of how this will work within the deep desert, but since the deep desert is split into sectors or regions, maybe the same sort of thing applies, but pure speculation. But to you guilds, this could be something to try muck around with. So if anyone's wondering how many worms can be simultaneously active within Haggar Basin, it appears to be only 8 as per the dev's comment. Tip number 8. This one's more focused about using your skills. Now, if you find your situation where it might be quicker to use a skill like, say, the Bindu sprint to get the hell out of there, you might just have to ditch your vehicle. Sometimes you will have to make that decision of jumping off your vehicle and using one of the skills to get you out of the situation. Now, this next tip I don't have footage of, but if you've seen some of the previous videos, we cover the insane amount of vertical lift you can get when you combine your hook shot, too much Zelda, your sugar wire, when coupled with the Emperor's Wing. Now, if you don't know, you can get pretty much anywhere within Vermilius Gap using this combination. It's absolute insanity. Now, speculating, but I believe you could use this technique to escape a sandworm, but I believe it would mostly work with something like the buggy, where you'd sort of crouch down on the side of it and then fire your sugar wire, launching you vertical, which for the moment may help you get away, as it might kill your vehicle, but you'll be able to keep all the gear on you. This is a bit of pure speculation. I don't know if this will actually work, but I imagine something like this is going to be viable. However, when you land, you're still going to have to make it back to some kind of safety, but definitely something to consider and something worth testing. I'll definitely give this a crack. But as you can see from the example footage in the background, you can get insane amount of lift using this kind of technique, surely something like this can be used to avoid getting eaten at the expense of losing your vehicle. But hey, if you can survive with all the gear you have on you, that is a huge, huge amount of time saved. Particularly if you're in the higher levels, that'd be considered a win. Tip number 9. This one's going to be fairly obvious, but ensure you have the environmental sounds on and you're paying attention to the rumbling, vibrations, or any visible sound ripples, as well as all the visual cues. You really do need to be linked into the environment. Whenever you venture onto the sand, you are constantly scanning around, looking for any of the sand that's blown up in the air, which will indicate a sandworm is near. And most importantly, you're listening for any rumbling or grumble, because that's a good early indicator that there's a sandworm nearby. If you want to play Dune Awakening on hardcore mode, just switch off all the sound and good luck. Plays such a pivotal role and makes the game very immersive as it speaks to you. Tip number 10, learn the terrain. If you're not familiar with the zone, take a lot more care. Try to remember the easier paths, the harder paths, because knowing where you can cross, where the drum sand is, all the little pieces of map information, as well as traversal, will make navigating around Vermilius Gap and probably beyond much easier if you're aware of landmarks, the drum sand, where are good places to cross, but that'll be a video for another day. Another tip is, if you're venturing out on the sand, make sure you open your map, because if there is a worm that has been aggroed, it should appear on your map. This can be helpful, as you'll know not to go onto the sand, or that you have shorter time to spend on the sand if there's a nearby aggroed worm. But again, it will still have to go through the animation. It just means it'll happen faster. And building from that, if you've triggered a worm and it's headed in the other direction, just be careful, because sometimes they swing right back around. And if enough time hasn't passed, they won't have to go through the animation. But from my testing, that's a little bit of a rarer scenario, but they do come back, but generally they will have to play the animation. Another important thing to know is, at least within the beta, the first time you get eaten by a sandworm, you kind of get a redemption. You have the opportunity to receive a free Make One sand bike. This can be extremely helpful early on, relatively meaningless later. So if you do get eaten, just know that you can fall back on getting a new sand bike, and that will just help speed up progression again, but a good little safety net. Don't know if that will be in the real game, but at least in the beta it was. And finally, is it possible to outrun Shai Hulud? Well, I certainly reckon you can. And we're going to cover this in another video, as this one's already gone too long. But stay tuned. If you get anything out of this, consider liking, subscribing. It goes a really long way. Peace.